Hey there, duelists. Happy New Year, and welcome back to Team APS Plus. Hopefully you guys all enjoyed your holidays. I certainly did. I got to see some family, relax a little bit, and I took a short break from uploading videos. But now we're back to talk about a new Yu-Gi-Oh! Ban list that just got announced, and one that you may not have actually heard of. This is a ban list update for Yu-Gi-Oh! Speed Duels, of all things. Now, I know a lot of people think of Yu-Gi-Oh! Speed Duels as just this sort of weird gimmick format, or some people just think it's dead entirely, or knock off Duel Links. But Speed Duel is actually really fun, and it's something that a lot of people do play. It's oftentimes a side event at major YCS events or even regionals, and there is an entire metagame to it. It still gets products. We've obviously played a few house tournament videos and stuff with it. So it just got a ban list, and you might be thinking, okay, that's great, but I still don't care. Well, the reason why I wanted to talk about it is because it uses a slightly different format than the traditional sort of TCG style ban list. And I wanted to talk about that format, the cards itself, and then also like how this could possibly be integrated with the regular TCG, although there might still be a few problems with that. Welcome to the new year, Speed Duelists. On January 21st, we'll implement an updated events-only limited list for all Speed Duel events. So, they say the Speed Duel limited list works like the Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links Forbidden and Limited list. So this is actually the exciting part. Okay, so they've got Limited 1, Limited 2, and Limited 3. So, with Limited 1, it says only one out of the following cards out of all the cards that are Limited 1 can be used in your deck and side deck. The cards are Jinzo, Reinforcement of the Army, Nightmare Wheel, and Zoma the Spirit. So for Limited 2, it says only two of the following cards out of all the cards that are Limited 2 can be used in your deck and side deck. That's Cocoon of Ultra Evolution, Parasite Paranoid, Allure of Darkness, Foolish Burial, and Union Hanger. And just real quick, I wanted to show you guys Cocoon of Ultra Evolution. It's a skill card, so if you don't play Speed Duel, you may not be as familiar with this, but basically the way that these work is that they're cards that you can kind of activate usually in your main phase to get a certain bonus sort of effect, and then they usually flip back over. This particular one lets you tribute a monster that's got an equip spell on it, and then summon a large insect from your deck, and it also has the graveyard shuffling effect to draw that's sort of similar to the card that it's based on in the TCG. And finally, Limited 3 is Breaker the Magical Warrior, Cyber Dragon, DD Warrior Lady, Book of Moon, Cosmic Cyclone, Crystal Raigeki, and Floodgate Trap Hole. Now, traditionally in the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG, a card can be at 0, at 1, at 2, or at 3. And a card being at 1 or being limited just means that you can use one copy of it in your deck. But you can still use several different cards that are limited to 1 in your deck. So for example, I can use one copy of Armageddon Knight, one copy of Dino Wrestler Pankratops, one copy of Monster Reborn, and one copy of Called by the Grave, all in my regular TCG deck. They're each limited to 1, but I can just use one of each of them. This differentiates it a bit because if a card is on the limited 1 list, you can only have one copy of one of those cards in your deck. So the example they give here is if you use Jinzo, then that means you can't use Reinforcement of the Army, Nightmare Wheel, or Zoma the Spirit in your deck at all. Similarly, with the limited 2 cards, you can choose up to 2 of the listed cards to use in your deck. Whichever you use, you won't be able to use any of the others. You can still choose to have multiple copies of the same card, but they'll count towards the limited total. So the example that they give here is if you use 2 copies of Parasite Paranoid, then you won't be able to use Cocoon of Ultra Evolution. But you could use 1 copy of Parasite Paranoid and 1 copy of Cocoon of Ultra Evolution, and if you do that, then you would not be able to use Allure of Darkness, Foolish Burial, etc. And finally, for Limited 3, you can choose up to 3 of the listed cards, and you can still use multiples, but remember that you can only have a total of 3 in your deck among them. So just a quick look at the cards here. It kind of makes sense. Not all of you guys probably play Yu-Gi-Oh! Speed Duels, but for those that do, it's a much sort of slower and kind of older Yu-Gi-Oh! Feeling format, and so a lot of the cards here are extremely powerful. So for example, you could use 3 copies of Reinforcement of the Army in a 20 card deck, might I add. Speed Duel decks are 20 to 30 cards, which is huge amounts of consistency. The same goes for something like Allure of Darkness or Foolish Burial. Decks that are much smaller are still going to use multiples of these crazy cards. And then you've just got like these staple things like Breaker, the Magical Warrior, DD Warrior Lady, Cosmic Cyclone, that are just really great, like, high value removal sort of staple type cards that you could have 3 copies of, and you could really just make a deck with simply those cards. And since it's a 20 card deck, it's extremely consistent, extremely strong. And so I think that their reasoning for doing this list is to basically sort of promote deck variety, and I think it's really cool. So like I said before, if you want to use one of these 4 cards, you can only get to use one of them. And if you want to use, say, any of these cards that are limited 3, then you could use like 2 Breaker the Magical Warrior and 1 DD Warrior Lady, but then you wouldn't get to use any of the other cards. Or you could use like 1 Book of Moon, 1 Cosmic Cyclone, and 1 Floodgate Trap Hole, but then you don't get to use Breaker or DD Warlady in those examples, or Cyber Dragon or something like that. Okay, so with the speed duel talk out of the way, how could this possibly apply to the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG? Well, I've got the TCG ban list pulled up here, and while this is not a one-to-one translation, I did think it would be kind of interesting to go over. So, here are the limited cards in the TCG, and what this would basically mean if we kind of followed the same rule is that if I used Armageddon Knight in my deck, I would not be able to use any other limited cards. So that's pretty extreme. I think that that's probably something that a lot of players would not like, at least at a glance. It just seems like this is heavily limiting the amount of cool, fun cards that you can use. For instance, imagine only being able to use like one Danger Jackalope and then having no access to Danger Tsuchinoko along with it. That seems a little harsh. There are a lot of cards in this list that just only really work when they get to have each other around. So say being able to use only one Sky Striker Engage, but then not be able to use multi-roll or Hornet Drones at all seems extremely restrictive, like honestly to an obnoxious degree. So this already tells us that there's probably going to have to be, if they ever want to do this to TCG, I'm not saying that they will, but if they wanted to, there would have to be some concessions to be made. I think that this list, this entire list of limited cards would just be a lot shorter, a lot smaller in the TCG because, well, I mean, if you only are allowed to have literally one total of these things, that's crazy. I think this gets a little bit different though when you get down to the semi-limited list, and this is kind of where I think that things get a little bit more interesting. So limit 1, as we know, is really restrictive, but I think that putting cards at limit 2 or limit 3 could be a lot more interesting. So take the Sky Striker example that I just mentioned. If Sky Striker players had, say, multi-roll and engage and Hornet Drones on a limit 3 list, then that would mean that they could use, say, 2 engage and 1 multi-roll. Or you could use 1 Hornet Drones, 1 engage, 1 multi-roll, or any kind of combination of those things. But it would also mean that you couldn't use anything else on the limit 3 list. Another example might be, say, the Armageddon Knight thing. You might want to use Armageddon Knight, and you might want to use, say, Black Dragon Collapse Serpent and like White Dragon Wyver Burster, right? They're all limited. If we assume that they're maybe on the limited 3 list, then you could use all 3 of them, but then you would not be able to use any of these other cards that are on the list. So that might take away your danger cards or your Destrudo, which are sort of maybe commonly used things alongside Armageddon Knight. So you've probably already noticed a small issue here. The TCG ban list just does not really lend itself well to this new style of list, at least not immediately. I think a lot of different things would have to change, and that's kind of where I'm interested in hearing what you guys think about it. Because I do think that limited 1 would have to be a pretty small set of cards, whereas I think limited 2 and limited 3 is where most of the cards that are currently limited to 1 would probably have to go. But do you think that this level of deck building would be something that TCG players would be happy with? I mean, I know that we are always asking about, sort of slowing the game down and limiting the amount of just extenders that somebody can use and strong blowout cards that somebody can use, cards that can be used in a loop. And so I think that TCG players might be a little bit dissatisfied with the idea of the strength of the cards that they're able to use, the amount of those cards going down so drastically. And the second issue here is this is a little bit hard to keep up with. So in the Speed Duel example, there's really not that many cards. There's 4 on limit 1, 5 on limit 2, and 7 on limit 3. And the Speed Duel card pool in general just is not very large. It's not nearly as big as the TCG's card pool. With the TCG though, this could be like, 20 cards in limit 1, 30 cards in limit 2, 50, 60 cards in limit 3. It could be huge. I mean, we already know the ban list on its own can be a little bit difficult to mentally keep track of, but at least it's easy to know that, okay, a card's at 1, I can only use 1. A card's at 2, I can only use 2. It would be a little bit weirder to think, okay, a card's at limit 3, which means I can only use a total of 3 of this large list of cards. It just might be just a lot to handle, a lot to kind of mentally calibrate with for players. And it would probably be a bit of a headache for judges who are checking deck lists because these rules would just definitely get broken. There might also just be a lot of room for abuse. It would take a very different approach, I think, to balancing than what Konami is probably used to with the TCG. Right now, it's easy to keep Sky Striker Engage at 1 because you know that it just simply cannot be used at an amount more than 1. But if you say let players have 3 engage in exchange for not being able to run any other cards that are on the same limit list as it, that could be a balancing mechanism, but it could still just mean, okay, there's 3 engaged and Sky Strikers is obnoxiously strong right now. So I want to hear from you guys. What do you think of this list format more specifically? Not so much the individual cards. I know a lot of you guys may not really play Speed Duels and care, but do you think this is something that could translate well to the TCG? What sort of changes would have to maybe be made? Do you think that logistically it would work? And what would you like to see on it? Personally, I think that it's something that really works well for speed duels, but I think it would probably be a little bit too cumbersome to try out in the TCG. But since I know a lot of us talk about alternate formats so much around here, and something that a lot of people feel like Yu-Gi-Oh! Really needs right now, it is still just something that I figured would be interesting to talk about, and maybe other people would have opinions on it too. All right, that's going to be it. I'll see you guys in the next video. Pass turn.